This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the De Facto Leaders Podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered.
Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 217 of the De Facto Leaders Podcast on the B Podcast Network. In this episode, we deep dive with educational consultant and innovator Dr. Kate Anderson Foley, who challenges conventional wisdom about student support systems and offers a fresh perspective on educational leadership. Dr. Foley shares revolutionary ideas about restructuring intervention frameworks and explains why some traditional approaches may be limiting student potential. Dr. Anderson Foley is founder and CEO of the Education Policy and Practice Group, an international keynote speaker, and Harvard Medical School Institute of Coaching Fellow. Beginning as a special education teacher, she rose to senior leadership in Illinois, creating systems, addressing opportunity gaps, and equity-based funding reform. Dr. Kate partners globally on improvement processes and asset-based education policies while authoring books including Ida Finds Her Voice, Fearless Coaching, and Radically Excellent School Improvement. Episode highlights include the Double Helix Model, and in this episode, Dr. Kate introduces her groundbreaking concept comparing educational support systems to the DNA's double helix structure and talks about how demonstrating interwoven approaches create stronger outcomes than linear siloed interventions and why we shouldn't label students according to tiers. She also talks about restructuring those RtI tiers and her compelling case for removing the traditional tiered structure of response to intervention. Dr. Kate flips conventional thinking by arguing that what's often labeled as duplication of services actually represents valuable cross-pollination of educational approaches, high quality versus traditional tutoring, and we distinguish between those two things. And then we also discuss Agile versus waterfall leadership. Be sure to check the show notes for all the places you can go to connect with Dr. Anderson Foley. Also, be sure to check out the School Leaders Guide to Executive Functioning Support, a 7-day course to help school leaders launch their executive functioning implementation plan. You can learn more about the course at drkarendudek-brannan.com/school leaders. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Kate Anderson Foley. Today, I am joined by Dr. Kate Anderson Foley from the Education Policy and Practice Group. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thanks for having me, Karen. I really appreciate it. I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. So there's a lot of really great topics that we want to get into today, but I thought we'd start off by having you just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, your history, and then what you're doing now.
Well, I started out as a special education teacher, but from the perspective of they're all general education students first.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the switch.
Yeah,
that was the switch. And then from there, I knew I wanted to have a bigger impact on the world. And I went into administration at the county level, did a lot of work at the early childhood level, actually, created inclusive preschools. And that from there, grew my practice. Special education, autism spectrum was one of the areas of practice for me. And then from there, I went into larger administration, directors of special education, assistant superintendent, chief of diverse learners, and then I was the assistant superintendent for the State Board of Illinois. And then I decided that I really wanted to have an even greater impact. And so I left the public sector and went into private practice and founded the Education Policy and Practice Group in 2018. And I've been working with districts around the globe on the improvement process, the strategic planning, but then really then the practices that are going to get students the positive outcomes that they need and that they deserve and that society requires of them.
Yeah,
That's
great.
in a nutshell.
Yeah. So before we talk about some of the other things, I know we wanted to talk about leadership and coaching and the pandemic, but with your experience, so you've been at the district level, the county level and the state level, and now bigger than that. So I'm curious, what was different for you when you made all of those switches? Like, I know that, so I was at the district and now I'm at the state level, but in a different agency in child welfare, not education. And I know that when you shift into a different role, sometimes you're like, this is not, there's some things that surprise you where you're like, I thought things were this way, but they're actually this way. So, like, when you went from district to county, county to state, like, what were some things that popped out that were surprising to you when you made those transitions?
I think overall, the biggest aha, even though I know it academically, but on this, when you're walking it,
Yeah.
is the silos, the
Mm-hmm.
absolute silos. And I'll be bold enough to say people that want to protect their own departments and stay in that isolation bubble because
Yeah.
that's power structure instead of me coming in and going, how can we work together? That's always my question. How do we break down the barriers and create a comprehensive structure or system or organization that benefits all students, because that is our client. From an
Yeah.
education standpoint, that is our client. And having the courageous conversations to be able to say, well, this isn't working, and so how do we need to shift and make it an okay process, create that structure to say, we really can work together, and you'll always have your department and I'll have mine or whatever, but we're working together in a common way. That's been the biggest shift for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know it's really interesting when you're like, you don't realize how siloed and what kind of a bubble you're in until you get out of the bubble. And I've even noticed that with certain niche areas. So things like autism and ADHD, they're kind of their niche. And then you move over to talking about dyslexia, and then that's kind of a niche, and there's overlap. Or even
Right.
just the disciplines. Like when I go into groups that are just speech pathologists, there's some similar conversations when you go over to the literacy groups. But
Yeah.
yeah, it is really interesting how you're like, you think that everybody is speaking the same language and terminology, and then you go over to another group and people don't know what you're talking about. Like when you say certain
Absolutely.
terms.
Absolutely. So you bring up an interesting story. When I was a special ed teacher, I immediately reached out to the speech and language pathologists and said, let's work together.
Hmm. Yeah.
Because not only
Yeah.
from the lesson design, but from the implementation, I learned from her, she learned from me, curriculum, et cetera, et cetera. And then we were able to take it and move it into the student's classroom,
Yeah.
not my classroom, the classroom of that student, and work with transitioning, work on the transfer of skills, helping the general education teacher build up their skill set. And to me, that's power. And so now in my work, certainly all throughout my career and in my work today, really focusing in on how are we situating the adults?
Yeah.
How are we helping them not only co-design, not from a fluffy kind of, oh, we're co-designing, it's from a strategic and scientific standpoint, and then be able to deliver with that precision and support the student, but then support the entire piece of that, the education itself and the teachers. And a lot of it is in the collaboration team structure.
Hmm.
People call them TBTs, teacher-based teams or professional learning communities, whatever that collaboration structure is, we need to make sure that all the adults are situated in such a way, to your point, you can draw upon those disciplines, but then be able to have that cross-pollination. I call that comprehensive service delivery.
Yeah, that is a very interesting conversation because sometimes people use the word duplication of services.
Uh,
And yeah, I think that would be an interesting thing to talk about. Like, what's the difference? Because people talk about duplication of services like it's a bad thing, but
yeah,
there should be some redundancy. Like the way that I explain it to people, because I have a lot of SLPs who are like, well, what's my role in literacy when there's
right.
a reading specialist and a special ed teacher? And I might be able to say, this is how it looked for me, and here are some things that fall within your scope. But some of those things don't only fall within your scope. And it's almost like this Venn diagram of like, here's what you're
Yes.
both working on. Here's what the SLP's working on. Here's what the special ed teacher's working on. And it might commonly look this way, but that's not rigid. How do you differentiate that, like good cross-pollination versus bad duplication of services? Or is the duplication of services not a good way to think about it?
Well, I think that maybe there's a little bit of a false positive on that, that
Yeah.
the double piece is a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
But let's
Like,
flip that. Let's flip it to say, so you have your unique and specific set of services that you are delivering for that particular student: expressive, receptive, executive functioning, et cetera, et cetera.
mhm.
So take that core topic that you are working on with the student and then use it. I think of it like a star, like it's spraying out. So how
Yeah.
can each of those points then
Mhm.
address that core competency within the general education? Maybe it's within the art class, maybe it's within the reading. Like that's where the array needs to come out. And,
Mhm.
and everyone needs to look at not only their area of expertise, but then ask the question, how? How do I incorporate that competency into my lesson design and then my execution of it? And then, of
Mhm.
course, the most important part is the assessment. That if we're all working on the same type of competency, that skill, then we can address it and assess it in a comprehensive manner. Not only are they doing it in speech and language, but they're able to demonstrate it with the reading specialists, with the general education, social studies, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And that's the conversation, because then that gets into the collaboration structure and shared accountability.
Mhm.
That's my non-negotiable,
Yeah.
shared accountability.
Yeah, so that makes me think of a couple things. Maybe we can get to the pandemic stuff now because I'm thinking a couple
Okay.
of a couple questions
Yes, yes, yes.
relating to what we're already talking about. But one of the most common questions that I get from people who are more in that clinical role and trying to figure out, well, I was trained a little more, air quote, medically, and I'm
Yep.
in a school now, so I have to figure out how to navigate my role in a school. And then one of the other things that's, I think, challenging is that people will say, so I have these IEP goals and I'm supposed to align to the curriculum, but what if what I am working on, so a common example that comes up for some of my listeners would be my students are struggling with comprehension and the teachers are working on comprehension strategies in the classroom, but my students don't have the foundational language skills, the vocabulary, the syntax to be able to comprehend. So and sometimes people will get pushback because they're working on syntax and saying that they're not aligned to the curriculum. Well, how do you think they're going to access the curriculum if you don't work on those language skills? So you're all working on the same thing. You're all working on comprehension, but the way that you do it might look differently because you are working on the foundational skills, and maybe the special ed teacher or the general education teacher is working on more of those high level skills. And I think that sometimes people start to do the blind man and the elephant thing where it's like,
Right.
I'm
Right.
looking at this big broad set of skills saying this is where we should be focusing. Well, maybe
Right.
you're all a little bit right, and maybe that's the star that you're describing.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So absolutely. And you bring up a couple examples that I actually walk the audience through in my latest book.
Mm-hmm.
And comprehension is huge. That's why I advocate we need to make sure that the adults are situated. If the students are at the center of it all, that star, that array, then how are we situating ourselves, the adults, with the planning? And then here's the transfer of skill. You just talked about the syntax with an SLP. Well,
Yeah.
the education teacher might not totally understand that. So it's incumbent upon the SLP to show how
Yeah.
it fits within the standard, within the comprehension,
Mm-hmm.
and help the teacher and her or him, this SLP, design things, design tasks, design ways that the student's going to demonstrate that skill.
Mm-hmm.
And the scaffolding of that, right? It's not like an automatic, well, we're working on syntax and here's the big, hairy comprehension standard.
Yeah.
Have to be able to show those breadcrumbs of how it starts to look, and then how you would ultimately be able to demonstrate that. That's why I keep going back to, when we comprehensively look at not only the improvement process, but the practices within that, not 10,000 practices, but the most powerful practices. And let's focus in on that and follow it all the way with deep implementation. And that way, all of us see each other. I wanted to just speak a little bit, because I have a lot of experience with the bumping up against medical, clinical, and educational.
Mm-hmm.
When someone is licensed in that clinical realm, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
But I always make it very clear, we are now in an education setting. So your role is to support that education of the student. Use your clinical knowledge, but look at it through the lens of grade level. How does the student access? How can we work with the array of teachers to build up that skill set? Because ultimately the student has to demonstrate that they understand. Because
Yeah.
that's how we move along, right? That's how students move along. That's how they should be moving along. So I've done professional development on just that topic. Here are the differences, and then describe and help the clinicians move away from those terms like clinician to,
Mm-hmm.
you're a social worker, you're a speech language pathologist, you're an occupational therapist, physical therapist, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
in education arena.
Yeah.
And this is how it looks a little different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is just,
It's huge.
yeah, it is. And I think that was probably one of the biggest shifts for me personally when I first, again, right out of grad school, started working in the schools and was really trying to navigate that shift. So, a couple things that you said that really stood out to me is this idea of situating the adults properly, because I think that if you don't have the right systems in place, it's almost like these containers that the
Yeah,
adults need in order to make sure that the practices happen. And I think there's a kind of a toggling between what are the systems and then what are the practices that go within those systems. And some of the newsletters that you shared with me before this interview, there are a couple things that really stood out. So this idea of the pandemic, and I would add all the technology and social media as
right,
well as
right,
this magnifying glass. It's not like it, quote, caused
correct,
these equity issues, but it amplified things that were already there and made them more obvious. And I know that you looked at some of these schools that bounced back more
right.
quickly than other schools, other states, and what are they doing differently?
Yep,
One thing that popped out, which I think is really interesting in this context of clinical versus educational, is this high quality tutoring and extended learning time, because I see those as like where there's this, they kind of fit in that, well, what are these other interventions that we're doing to bolster students' experiences? And I know that some clinicians kind of play in that space of that high quality tutoring. So I guess a good place to start is what, how do we define what high quality tutoring is? Because there's tutoring and there's
Right.
high quality tutoring. So how do you make the distinction of what high quality tutoring is?
The high quality tutoring was grounded in what was being done inside the classroom at the universal level, instead of an add-on, instead of the siloed piece of, well, we need to work on reading. Let's work on reading and isolation. We talked about this at the very beginning. We need to work not,
Yeah.
down the silos and look at things in a holistic way. The tutoring, the learning, the extensions, all was within the process of moving students. And so within that, then there were the collaboration teams, which I spoke about, but I think needs to be amplified.
Mm-hmm.
That is the structure every single school needs to have. And then within that is analysis, the data analysis of looking at student work. So the districts that were just in isolation of using the money for after school tutoring, which when you looked at it, it wasn't high quality because there were snacks, there was movement, there was this, like all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's looking at what it is that the students needed. And that was the direct instruction. And then the practice of those instruction. So that was the differential between, hey, we've got after school tutoring. Do you want your student to come?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of saying, hey, parent, this is what's going on. We need you at the table. We need the commitment. And then we're delivering that. Now, some of that high quality tutoring was within the school day. Some of it was beyond the school day, either before or after, or, built in within, that unstructured time.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the things. And again, the other was the high quality instruction and then the data analysis. Like those three prongs were differential of the high quality.
Yeah, what I see is the distinction is the strategic element. Like, is there an assessment of skills
Yeah,
rather than here's the worksheet you need to get
that's
done this
correct.
week, which maybe that worksheet has to do with skills. Maybe there's some strategic practice, but maybe there's not. And maybe the skills that this particular student needs in order
Yeah,
to be able to access their curriculum is not in whatever the homework assignment is this week. It's that
right.
differentiation, which if you don't have data and assessments, how do you know what the skills are?
But
So,
there's nobody working together in the sense that, well, you're the tutor, but I'm the teacher. I don't really know what you're doing. And then
yeah.
but we flip it on the high quality side says we all know what each other's doing,
Yeah.
right? So you talk about a worksheet. It's like, ugh, I put the big X in front of
I
that.
know. Well, that word just automatically makes
Oh,
people's eyes
it's
glaze
dread,
over.
right. It's dreadful. So when you think
Yeah.
about it, if it does that to adults, what's it doing for the kids?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we talk about the other social media and technology. I had a conversation or I did a lecture to university and then city people, and I said, so many states are now banning cell phones.
Yeah.
Okay. But the real question is, so what now what?
Yeah.
How it
That's
comes to engagement.
right. Right.
That's the key.
Mm-hmm.
All about engagement. So how are you going to engage the student that they're going to want to not only pay attention, but in my mind, the bigger skill is persistence
Mm-hmm.
because learning is hard, but learning cognitively, you got to have that right cognitive load, be able to go, okay, this is hard, but I'm going to keep going
Mm-hmm.
instead of giving up. Like that, to me, that's the most important question. And that goes to um, relevant content. Is it intriguing to the student? Do they see themselves in that they're going to go, oh yeah, okay. But what am I really teaching them? I'm teaching them reading comprehension. I'm teaching them left to right. I'm teaching them phonetic awareness, like all of those different,
Right.
but it's interesting to them. I'll say one other thing. And this has been a lifelong struggle with districts. You have a ninth grader is reading at the second grade level.
Yeah.
And there's been many teachers, I've seen it. I've had the conversation where they'll give them primer level content.
Yeah.
You're like, well, wait a minute. So you're wondering why the student is behavior
Bored.
out of control.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
how do you teach the skill scaffolded up to the standard, but then of interest? Yeah, that's
Hmm.
hard work. That is hard work.
Hmm.
But that's the right work, right?
It is. That's a common one because,
Right.
obviously a primer is going to seem almost
It's
condescending to
insulting.
a ninth grader,
Exactly.
and they want to be, and I've seen people go too far with it where they say it's not interesting, or almost think that it's too late, or well, we just need to have them listen to audiobooks because those are more interesting, which of course that's a really good piece. They're going to get the language, they're going to be engaged with literature, but they're not going to learn how to decode
Right.
written symbols if you're only focusing on audiobooks. Obviously, that's going to help build some language skills and build some good foundation, but you also have to be working with print. So that's a big challenge is in finding things that are interesting for those older
Absolutely.
students.
And so again, when I was teaching and then all throughout my career, but now think about how exponentially technology has grown.
Yeah.
So let's use it. An example that I always say is, so use the student's words, recording it,
Hmm.
and then transcribe it. That's engaging. The student goes, hey, that's me on that page. And then they're going to be able to start left to right, you know, word, symbol, putting the words together, putting the sentence together, and then you strange that into writing. So,
Hmm.
so how would you extend that one sentence you just said? What would you want to say more of? Let's
Right.
put in that, like, let's write that down and then let's read that. Like, there's so many ways that you can do that.
Are you working with students who experience anxiety and overwhelm with new challenges, who refuse or avoid difficult tasks, or require constant prompting? Or maybe they have difficulty filtering distractions, they're missing assignments, they tend to run late, and they struggle to transfer skills from one setting to another, or don't appear to learn from past mistakes. These behaviors are showing up more and more frequently in classrooms across schools and not just in special education. The truth is, we're seeing a surge of students in both general and special education who desperately need these foundational skills. With so many competing priorities and options for educators, it seems impossible for school leaders to know where to focus their attention. What if there was a way to transform multiple challenges with one powerful approach without overwhelming your already maxed out team? Turns out there is. Beneath many of these challenges often lies a powerful root cause: executive functioning. Executive functioning skills are the critical mental processes that work behind the scenes as your internal coach, acting like your brain's CEO. These powerful cognitive abilities help you manage frustrations, make decisions, follow through on plans, envision the future, and adapt when things don't go as expected. And let's be honest, teachers are drowning between curriculum requirements, testing pressures, behavior management, and the mountain of paperwork. They're stretched thinner than ever. The last thing they need is another standalone program to implement. That's why I've created the School Leader's Guide to Executive Functioning Support, a 7-day course to launching your team's executive functioning implementation plan. When you join, each day you'll get an email with a summary walking you through a foundational concept that will help you design an implementation plan for your team. We'll uncover executive functioning challenges, and I'll show you how to identify the telltale signs. We'll organize skills for intervention, and we'll wrap up with essential takeaways and a prompt to help you get started with your 90-day action plan, plus a curated list of resources to provide support and help you implement what you've learned. To learn more about the School Leader's Guide to Executive Functioning Support, go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/school leaders. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where I think that some people are resistant to top-down regulation and standards, which I see it as sometimes it's actually a relief to have certain decisions made
Yeah,
for you,
absolutely.
but then there's so much room for the art and creativity within those standards. I see the standards as allowing you to be more creative by alleviating some decision making rather than making people feel boxed in, which unfortunately I've seen that narrative, which is
Right.
not helpful.
Right. Well, I agree with you from the standpoint of it's a progression. It's a
Yeah,
ladder. Like they've done the hard work for you.
right. The
But you put in
non-negotiables.
second and fourth and eight, like whatever. But within that is the creativity.
Hmm.
And that's where all educators need to practice within those standards. How would you be creative? How would you I'm going to speak to the false notion of the tiers.
Hmm.
So
Oh
many,
yeah.
so many states and districts silo the kids. Well, they're a tier one kid, they're a tier two kid, they're a tier three kids, where I have put it on its head and created the double helix system of support. So that's the base within the improvement process itself. But embedded in that is making real time pivots, decisions, if you will, because you're
Hmm.
always assessing. So whatever the standard is and whatever the lessons are, the teacher is being very precise in listening, watching, seeing how the student's learning, and then be able to modify in real time. That's the nimbleness. And that's the creative part then within the standard, right? That you're not just lockstep of doing this lesson, but you're being able to set it up so the groups of students can get the differentiated support through the interventions, not labeling the kids, but really labeling the intervention. Well, this group needs XY, this group needs Z. Okay. And then, the students who already had the skill, they can scaffold it up even higher. You're not jumping out of the grade level standard, you're making it more robust and sophisticated. So that's where I see the standards being just the framework, like kind of like the sandbox, if you will,
Yeah.
and the creativity is within that. But it's not haphazard creativity. It's very precise creativity. And you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
the idea of the instruction being tiered, not the students being
That's
tiered, and the
correct.
idea of that a student you can toggle between quote tier one, tier two with the student based on what they need
Right.
rather than having it be rigid and putting students in these siloed situations because and I've seen that with the clinicians as well, where they really want to get into this idea of a hierarchy of skills and like when am I moving through the stages? And sure, that way of thinking is relevant and if you use it flexibly, knowing like here's a progression of skills, here's how I can scaffold and go back and forth, but understanding that you might have to do one step forward, two steps back, and go back and forth within even the explicit instruction framework of
Right.
when are you in modeling, guided practice, independent practice? Well, you don't just magically move from being done with modeling. A student might be
That's
independent practice, and then you might have to back up and model something. Like it's
right.
not rigid, and
Right.
there's not one setting where it's only modeling and only independent practice. It's
Yeah.
sprinkled in, even though
Yeah.
some people might be doing one more than other depending on their role.
That's right. And wherever you're collecting your data, that might be
Yeah.
the location, if you will. But you've got to be able to show it in a variety of settings across subject areas. I know when I professionally developed and certainly in the role of director for IEPs, it was always we need to talk about what's really happening with the student. What are they able to do? Not that you can start with a sentence of, Kate's a really nice girl. Okay, that's a fluffy sentence, but
Yeah.
let's get real about this.
Yeah.
This is what she can do. This is what she still needs help on. So precision, identification of that skill, and then be able to take it apart to put it back together. I as the, speech path or OT, but then I need to be able to look to the other settings. This is in general education. This is where it would show up. This is where it would show up in music class or art class, whatever it might be. And then be able to comprehensively address that. I know when I was still at the district level, I really pushed the notion of like a 3-in-1 model. So 3 weeks of really that
Oh,
one
yeah.
student, 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 But the fourth week was working on behalf of the student, not writing reports necessarily, but working with the general education teacher, working with family, working with, whatever it might be, because I always focus in on transference of skill, right? And especially for students on the autism spectrum, they can do it right here, but they don't see the application over there.
Yep.
And our role is to make the bridge to say, and let's put it over here now. And then explicit, model, practice, and then you've got the skill set independently. So those all have to be thought through. And that's the work that I love to do with people, is to get in there, roll up the sleeves, because I have the expertise in that. Why? Because I invested in learning. I always thought it was fascinating with speech language pathologists, so I learned as much as I could. I was a special education teacher by trade, but I didn't have the standing with the general education teachers when mainstreaming came out. So I went back to school and got my general education license. I wanted to be able to stand and say, I know what I'm talking about, right? And so I always encourage related service providers to say, I know what I'm talking about. And I'm going to help you knit this together in an educational way for the student. And then let's work together.
Yeah, that's the 3-to-1 model. That is a great example of a system change that is, and I did trial it when I was in the schools and I got a little traction with it, but it was hard to do it by myself. And I think that
That's right.
I got and honestly, I felt like I had the trust with my administration and some of the staff that I had worked with, that they were like, okay, go for it. If you have a good rationale, you try it out. But then even just some of the other SLPs in the area were like, are you allowed to do that? Like, what about the minutes? What about this? What
Yes,
about
you
that?
are.
And I do think like I said, it would have been helpful if it was more of a broader
That's right.
initiative,
Right.
because it got a little bit of traction, but it wasn't as impactful as it could have been if everybody was doing it. Because,
Right.
and like you said, it's a lot of these people who are in that support role that could be supporting the general education teachers. Well, if you're in back-to-back therapy sessions all day,
You
when do you
can't.
have time to do that? And are the teachers getting enough time to be able to meet with you as well? That was another challenge that I had, where it was, okay, great, I'm going to arrange my schedule and do all my therapy in 3 weeks and then have this off week. Well, you don't want people to think you're just sitting in your office doing
That's right.
paperwork, but then they also have to be available to meet with you. Otherwise, the coordination gets so challenging. And I think that's the biggest barrier that I hear from people who are, again, frontline working with students. Nobody will argue with you and say, oh, no, collaboration is not important, but it's when and how, and they're going to default to what's comfortable when things
Yeah.
get busy, which it always is. So,
Yeah. So that's why, excuse me, I like to work with leadership on just that topic. This is a powerful practice, right? That's an efficacious practice. We have the data to say that it works, but we have the structure that's not aligned. So
mhm.
how do you look at the bell schedule? How do you start to look at your day? The title of my book is Radical Excellence, not like this haphazard, radical stuff, but it's the boldness. And my question is always, if nothing was holding you back, what would you do?
Yeah.
If nothing was holding you back, how would you change the bell schedule so to do all the things that you just talked about? So the speech path or OT or special ed, whatever, that team can work on behalf of the student with the general education teacher or staff or whatever. Like that's where the boldness comes into place. Daring to dare,
hmm
right?
I think people sometimes think it has to be this way.
It doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. I
It,
know.
but that's where adults and I think education really does themselves a disservice,
hmm
because there's this artificial structure. Well, you're elementary, so this is how it looks. This is middle school, this is how it looks. This is high school, this is how it looks. This is the bus schedule, so this is how it looks, right? Instead of putting students at the center, what do they need? How do we, the adults, support? And then how do we collectively move through getting really clear, getting those design features in place, and then building the shared accountability. And I would say supporting the shared accountability. And, I've written about some of this in the leadership side of, Agile leadership.
Yeah.
That, to your point, education needs to also look toward the business model and look at agility. Agile leadership is the ability to be able to, not haphazardly abandon or pivot or whatever, but it's short cycle assessments, short cycle goals. Here's the work that we do. Then we assess to say, did we do it? Great. Lean in, push more, or adjust and recalibrate and move on. And when I do a lot of executive coaching, as well as support the teachers on the instructional coaching model, but I also always talk about that. Well, what do students need? What's the data showing? What evidence do you have that your practices are working? Like the agility piece is a mind frame, but also the execution of being able to pull everybody in to say, we're all in this together. Here's our roles, and then, execute on those roles, come back and do the analysis of that.
Yeah. So I want to ask about data, but since we're on the topic of agile leadership, so I'm involved on the IT side, and I'm not sure, are you familiar with the agile methodology for IT? Yeah. So
that's where our colleagues may got it.
Yeah. Okay. I was wondering about that because I was like, oh, well, that word is familiar to me.
Yeah.
It's very interesting trying to do it in government, but that is another conversation for another day. But just the contrast between agile versus more of a waterfall method.
Right.
Do you think that in education they are more waterfall, which we should probably define that for our listeners before
waterfall, too slow. How about that?
Yes, too slow. So like this concept of
too slow,
we have
too
to have this plan that's going to be the whole thing, and we're going to plan out the whole thing that is, going to take 5 years, and we're not going to actually implement it and get any data or information, rather than agile, where we're going to get it good enough, we're going to implement something, get information, iterate on it, and then build as we go. Like continuously put it into the hands of our users and continuously implement pieces and adjust over time, versus wait 5 years to implement this plan and then realize, you know what, it would be better if we would have implemented some of it, because then we'd have more information.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. When I do strategic planning with districts and boards of ed, I do just that. I look at it from 100 days, half a year, 1 quarter. Like it's got to be alive. So yes, some districts have, the 5-year. I mean, I was involved in those 3 to 5 plans, and nobody paid any attention to them. None whatsoever.
And how often do those miss the mark because you don't get information?
That's correct. You might have the best information you have developing it, but it's more lofty goals and aspirational. But I'm absolutely aspirational, but it has to be grounded in reality.
Yeah.
And then be able to, what you just described, very short cycle. And this is where Agile comes in. It's you have a comprehensive plan, but within that, you have pieces that you're looking at constantly. And so what's the data? What's the data saying? Is it working? Then press. If it's not working and you have a substantial piece of data on it, I ask the question, so are you going to stop doing it? And this is where educators go, well, I don't know if we're, what? Can we do that?
Yeah.
Yes, you're saying you must do that. If you have something that's not working, you must let it go. and focus on the things that are working.
Mm-hmm.
It is amazing. You talk about the waterfall versus
Yeah.
agile. Waterfall is, well, let's just keep doing it and see if it's going to catch up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I say we don't have the time. And especially as you mentioned, the post pandemic and all the things that it was the magnifying glass. It didn't cause it, but it's exacerbated it.
Mm-hmm.
Gaps are getting bigger. But if we don't address that, here's what I have seen. More students are getting identified as quote unquote disabled. There is a huge uptick.
Mm-hmm.
That is a symptom of the larger issue. And the issue is ed. So again, I think the tiers are just insufficient. We must look at something in a different way. So again, I'll put forth my double helix system of support because it comprehensively does that in real time inside the classroom with all the experts that we've just been talking about. And you can rightly say, what is the intervention? It's not the student, right? Because oftentimes the tiers are just another pathway to special education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, totally.
Right.
People thought, oh, this is just, well, we can't use a discrepancy model, so this is how we're going to make
Exactly.
kids eligible under SLD.
Absolutely. And I've written so much about it, and I've helped a lot of districts around the country about that because they were like, well, RTI, blah, blah, blah. And now, well, RTI and MTSS is the same thing. I'm like, whoa, not really. And let's get clear about it. But again, it speaks to the larger issue. If everyone's mashing them up, then they don't understand. That's that waterfall that you talk about. Well, let's just keep doing it.
Mm-hmm.
See if things settle. See if words are going to come out. Instead of saying urgency, students don't have time. We need to stop spinning our wheels. How do we work together? So in fact, like collaboration teams, we're actually doing less work in isolation and more collaboratively. Teachers are happier because they're like, oh, I don't have to go back to do 40 grades when we've done this together.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's ways that we can do it. And that's the exciting part of why I decided to leave the public sector and go into private practice. I want to work with districts on these issues because for me, students are everything. And believe it or not, they're going to be adults a lot longer than they are kids.
Mm-hmm.
And we, the adults, are going to rely on them to carry on in society.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they have to be prepared.
Right.
They have to be prepared. So if I could just share this one little thing. By 2031, well, that's not too far, is it?
It'll come up on us.
That's a few short years. 70% of the working age people will need a degree or other post-secondary credential to meet the labor market.
Interesting.
Yet only 54% have that qualification. So we've talked about the gap from the pandemic. Now we've got a societal gap. If 70% are going to need this, but only half,
Mm-hmm.
that's a lot of work in a short amount of time.
Wow.
So,
yeah.
So equate that to the pandemic. Post-pandemic, it's been 5 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
5 more years.
We still have large groups of students that are a year behind. That year will turn into 2, will turn into 3, could turn into dropout. Or for students with IEPs, and I strongly advocate, they cannot afford to just have a certificate of attendance. They must graduate with a regular diploma. It is the gateway to their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why the work that you and I do and your colleagues do is vital to the larger picture.
Mm-hmm. So you've mentioned your double helix system of support. I want to give you the chance to define that a little bit more. But as you do that, because we have a lot of people who are doing these evaluations and many times something like a dynamic assessment, especially when you're measuring cognitive skills that are very difficult to quantify, it can be challenging to figure out how do you get the data that you need to make those agile decisions, but also still capture what's happening and individualized. So, and maybe those are two separate questions. Maybe we talk about the model and then talk about the data. But you've mentioned you making database decisions a lot, and I would really love to dive into that before the end because it's a different lens when you have a student right in front of you or when you're at the county or the state level and you have to make decisions about bigger initiatives. So yeah, maybe we'll start with the model and go to the
Yeah.
data or however you think is the best way to talk about that.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to the triangle, the RTI, MTSS.
Mm-hmm.
The triangle either points up or points down, but no matter it's directional. It's funneling students. It funnels kids away from the curriculum because the system is set up that it identifies students rather than the interventions.
Mm-hmm.
The double helix is a comprehensive way. It's actually the comprehensive foundation for the school improvement process. And I'm going to emphasize that because when we talk about students at risk, newcomers, English learners, and students with disabilities, that comprehensive system, those students are seen within the system. They're not seen as a siloed away. They're not seen as separate. And so the double helix, just like DNA, right? The strands complement each other, but they are also absolutely dependent on one another. So I've set it up where the clarity is like a strength-based approach, not from a deficit-based approach. It's not about what the kid can't do. It's about how are we, the adults, setting up the learning. It's the teaching and the learning, right? It's not the idea that, well, I taught it, they didn't get it. Drive by, right? Drive by.
Yeah.
We have to ensure that they've learned it. How are we going to do that? Let's get really clear on it. And that's where the standards come in. And those nimble and responsive ways that we're differentiating for the students within the classroom. High expectations of our students, absolutely a non-negotiable, right? That's where the boldness comes in, that you're not just saying, well, it's that student. How many times have you heard that? Well, that student, they can't. It's like, well, it's not incumbent upon you, the adult. What are you going to do?
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to do it? And then the accountability is shared by the evidence of impact. So we talk about the data and we say, is it making a difference? How do you know? That's the evidence. What evidence do you have that it's actually doing what it is designed to do, right? So that's the big clarity strand within the comprehensive system. The design features, I am bold and I say, ban the tiers. Think about that.
Mm-hmm.
In education, where
You
it's
just blew everybody's mind.
exactly where we talk about the waterfall. Oh, let's just keep doing it, right? And I say, no, ban the tiers and replace it with effective instruction, intervention, and acceleration practices inside the classroom. Now, within the classroom, then staff are comprehensively situated. Special ed, speech, OT, whatever it might be. Then those strategies, intervention, acceleration, are delivered with precision. We need to see ourselves as professionals. We are professionals. It's not haphazard. It's not the drive-by. It's not the, well, I taught them, that kind of thing. I talked about the data. The data is used to inform and adjust. That speaks, it's now embedded within the overall improvement process, right? We talked about, don't let that 5-year plan sit on the virtual, bookshelf.
Mm-hmm.
It's alive now. Why? Because we all know it. We've all been professionally developed on it, and we're all accountable for it. And then, you have those indicators that monitor the growth. That third strand, then, that overarching strand, is shared accountability. That's a huge statement. shared accountability. Speech path, special ed, principal, art teacher, we are all accountable for the student movement. But structurally, and this is where I did a lot of work at the district and at the state level, the interdependencies are intentional. For example, how is the special ed department partnering intentionally with teaching and learning? Human, fiscal, material resources. How are we situated? How are the business and the money side of things only going to those practices and those supplies and those resources that are going to address all of our students, but nested within there are the students who are furthest away from opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And then those academic and social dimensions of learning can then be delivered with precision. And that's the shared accountability, because that structure is there, that collaborative team structure where we're all focused on the same thing. You know, if I'm fourth grade, my fourth grade team is there. What are we working on? How will we know that the student has it? What do we do for students who haven't gotten it yet? And what do we do for students who've already got the skill, that acceleration, right?
Mm-hmm.
So instead of this haphazard way, scattershot way, it is precise. That's what I mean by precision. It's very precise. We all know what we're doing because there's clarity around it. We're all supporting it. And then there's the shared accountability so that that structure then can be deeply implemented. The Agile side would be, we need to adjust. Let's adjust. Don't wait for the end of the year and go, oh, that didn't work out too well. Let's figure out for next year. No, you have enough data. You need to move. You need to adjust. That's the dynamic improvement process.
It sounds like it's more about, I'm trying to find the right way to say this, but instead of being in these, like you said, these silos or these buckets,
right?
That we're taking everything and almost looking at it all together in
Correct.
one big bucket, all the way up to the fiscal level when we're figuring out how to
Yeah.
allocate resources. Because I could see how if you have your, like, here's our math or here's our tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, that you could all the way up to the level of how are we like paying for things and making sure that these different initiatives have resources, that things could get, I don't know, again, like very scattered, as you said. But if you're looking at it within this lens of we have to see the whole bird's eye view rather
Right.
than just here's the bucket that's going to address the general education, and here is the special ed budget, and here's the
Right.
math budget, and here's the reading budget, and here's the
Right.
that it could get very spread out.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this. So the other day I was at a conference, and this math expert said something about how, well, I'm concerned because all of the math instruction, there's so much work on, like, all of the math curriculum is all about executive functioning and not about math, which is really interesting because I was at the conference and I spent the entire day talking about executive functioning. But I completely understand what she means, where you don't say, well, we're not talking about math anymore. It's all about executive functioning. You still have to have that high quality math instruction. But
Right.
if you're thinking about the two of them together, you figure out how to embed
Exactly.
one thing on top of the other rather than thinking about it as these separate buckets.
Exactly. Exactly. So you take those disparate practices and you put them together in a comprehensive way, and you trail it all the way. So you think
Mm-hmm.
about fiscal, at this district level and at the state level. And I did some work at the federal level. You're talking about braiding the funding. So it's
Yeah.
working, you take those funds that are allowable, and you braid them together in a comprehensive way. So it addresses the students that it's designed for, but also addresses the larger issue.
Yeah.
And that's how you can get around, not in an inappropriate way, but in an appropriate way of how you look at funding.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
That's
that,
another one. Like, I think that it's hard to wrap your head around if you don't if you're not the one that's involved with making those decisions, you're just thinking about the students in front of you, but it is so important. So
Absolutely. You got to see how it all fits together.
mhm.
And again, call me. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how I like to work. So
Well, I know we're getting towards the top of the hour, and I'm sure we could keep going for many more hours,
yeah.
but I would love just, yeah, share where can people learn about your books, your resources, how to connect with you?
Right.
Yeah.
So my website is www.edpolicyconsulting.com, where I have all my resources. You can sign up for my newsletters. There's a form to fill out if you want to engage with me. Bring me to your district. There's a variety of ways to do that. I also have my email at kate@edpolicyconsulting.com, or call me 440-554-1789. Radically Excellent School Improvement, Keeping Students at the Center of It All, is out from Corwin. It came out in July. So you can find the link either at Corwin or on my website. And I like to work with districts. I like to work with state departments. I like to work with other entities. I will put a plug in. I'll be at the ASCD conference in San Antonio on June 30th. I'll be presenting some of the details of my book. And then I also have a 3-day that certainly can be tailored professional development on this book, where I really get into like the double helix, like how do you put it in action? It's one thing to say, "Ooh, this is big." You know, she's banning the tiers. Well, what does that look like? How do you structurally do that? So I take people through that process as well. And finally, I'll say, because one of my areas of expertise is special education law. I teach graduate level courses to aspiring superintendents and principals on those fair practices tied to the Andrew F. standard. And so I use my equity audit to get to that. I'll just say out loud, equity is not a bad word, even though current political and climate is suggesting so. Equity, trade the word for fair. What's a fair practice?
Yeah.
Is it good for everybody? Okay, then let's do that.
Yeah.
Right, let's do that. Right, because then everyone can be seen in the solution. And that's the comprehensive approach that I like to bring to districts.
Well, so thank you. Yep. Yeah, we'll link to all those. And thank you so much for being here.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all the places you can go to connect with our amazing guest. And also be sure to check the show notes for more information about the School Leaders Guide to Executive Functioning Support, a 7-day course that shows school leaders how to get started with their executive functioning implementation plan. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/school leaders. I created the School Leaders Guide to Executive Functioning Support because educators have to be everything to everyone in current times. There always seems to be a new initiative, and it can be really difficult for teams to implement yet another standalone program. But the great news about executive functioning support is that it doesn't require complicated materials. It can be seamlessly layered onto existing practices and amplify the effort that you put into content area curriculum. And most importantly, executive functioning support can help you to differentiate instruction for those students who need support in special education as well as general education. It can be a really powerful universal design initiative that ensures you're meeting students where they're at. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/school leaders. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts, and share this episode with anyone you think would benefit from the information. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.